Ici.
On. On.
Bien, bonjour à tous.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome. I would like to speak Italian, and I apologize for that. Welcome. And we are very pleased to have so many young people among us. They are the future. And I am an elderly man, and seeing so many young people who are here to imagine peace is very important. Welcome to this session. Yesterday, during the opening ceremony, we were able to appreciate some highly significant presentations. And our panel today was mentioned as being essential in terms of imagining peace. And in fact, the ideas shared by last night's speakers, including the President, Professor Riccardi, and everybody else, all of them mentioned the major challenges we all face. Pope Francis, in fact, often refers to a real shift we all face. Let me mention two things. The first is that in the prayers for peace, which Sant'Egidio began in 1987, after the very first one, we have always had the presence of non-believers or lay people. And the idea was to make sure that lay people were present at these meetings of ours, which are meetings of religious people. It's almost a way of underscoring how important it is to have an alliance between faith and reason, because no one dimension can survive without the other. Because otherwise we would head towards a form of fundamentalism which would make the other unsustainable. That's why we feel it is extremely important to organize meetings between believers and non-believers in all of our meetings. Now, I don't want to go over our long history. Our friend Tarek is more than familiar with the history of our meetings, which were marked by several moments of progress achieved through the sharing of ideas. Today's world, however, is something entirely new. So far, we have debated between believers and non-believers as we are trying to understand one another. Today, we face an entirely different issue. For the very first time in history, we are living in an era in which man can destroy both him and herself and creation through nuclear war, through climate change, as the Anglican representative was mentioning yesterday, through new technologies. Yesterday we heard about this in apocalyptic terms. So from this point of view, believers and non-believers have to debate these topics with one another, but above and beyond that, they have to be responsible for humanity, which runs the risk of being destroyed. We share a common responsibility, namely that of saving creation and humanity. I think that is something new which is asked of all of us, of all believers and men and women of goodwill. Therefore, I believe that that is the underlying theme of our panel. Imagining peace means we have to think about how we can save humanity, how we can be men and women. 4 years ago, at a conference in Rome, I invited a Japanese scientist whose name is Ishiguro, who created a clone which is entirely identical to him. And he sometimes sends that clone to attend conferences instead of him. And during that conference, what he said was that we are the last organic generation, whereas the next generation will be the lithium generation. And when I objected to that, he picked up his device and he said, "You already speak to your device. You already have arguments with it. If you expand that further, you will end up with a human clone, perhaps a lithium clone." Now, that is an exaggeration of sorts, but it does represent some major food for thought. And in this panel of ours, titled Lay and Believers Towards a Humanism of the Future, we will have to discuss the challenge we all face. And we always have to keep in mind that none of us can save ourselves alone. That is the challenge we face. We are condemned to sticking together. And that has to become a choice, a political and economic choice, a cultural choice, and even a spiritual choice. So let me thank all of our panelists. Let me thank all of you. We have a full house today. I'd like to welcome all those who joined us after the beginning of our panel. And I do hope that this morning our panelists can take the floor for some 10 to 12 minutes each. After that, we will have some time for some Q&A as a way of having an in-depth discussion. Now, let me just run down the list of our panel, and therefore I'm very pleased to begin by giving the floor to Monsignor Éric de Moulins-Beaufort, who is Archbishop at Reims, and he is also the president of the French Bishops' Conference since 2019, in fact. So you already have a 5-year experience as president of the French Bishops' Conference. Over to you, Monsignor. Thank you. Thank you, Your Excellency. I want to thank all of you. It's a privilege for me to take the floor this morning during this international meeting on peace organized by the Sant'Egidio movement. It is a privilege for me to attend this meeting for the first time. although I have been very interested in your activities for a long time now. Now, let me begin by the title of this morning's panel. Or rather, let me begin by the title of Paris's meeting, Imagine Peace, the International Meeting for Peace. And I'd like to share two ideas with you to begin with. The first refers to the closing ceremony of the Olympics, which was something everyone admired, of course. Although I have to say that I wasn't very keen about it, because based on the comments we heard on television, the general comment was that in a few decades our Earth will be entirely devastated, and that the remaining men would discover the Olympic rings hidden in the dust, and they would lift them up. The gesture of lifting these Olympic rings would symbolize a revival of Olympic values for renewed humanity. And the acrobats who represented human beings as they joined forces for this renewal were all dressed alike. They were hooded, they were masked. And it seemed to me that this exalted a form of collectivism comparable to that of answer bees. And the effectiveness of multiple and similar beings at the same time, all interchangeable, all commensurate with the tasks they have to accomplish. Now, this brings to mind another idea. I took a brief trip to Vietnam, and I watched two movies during my flights, and I discovered this saga that I had no idea of, and something that I find quite striking in visionary movies and books is that there is a common theme that of going back to a kind of brutal feudalism, a kind of Nazi or Soviet totalitarianism. We don't often see a humanity which is capable of developing the potential of Athens democracy, nor of the medieval cities democracies. They were lively and even less so, the democracy of the Renaissance. Now, maybe this is something which goes back to what the rabbi was saying yesterday, when he said that peace cannot be represented almost. In any case, as a Christian, I have to say that the idea of humanity, which Christianity brings to mind, is the Christianity of faces, which face one another. Christianity brings to mind men and women who look at one another, who allow others to look at them. A gaze which isn't used to measure or to exploit. In this case, one's gaze is something which allows us to be marveled and surprised. I think that that is a major idea in Christianity. In fact, the term Catholicism underlines that very fact. That term identifies unity in diversity. It underscores our differences, our commitments, and therefore this is a kind of humanity that Christianity brings to mind. That is my background, of course, but I believe that this humanity of faces, of gazes, is one shared by other religious and spiritual experiences, and even in certain anti-religious ideas. I think that is the challenge we all face in this day and age. We have to stimulate one another, and together we have to head towards a shared world so that through our spiritual, cultural, and historical resources, we can strive towards a humanism of diversity. And therefore, based on our common experience, we have to nurture the idea of humanity. And we have to tap into these spiritual resources, and we have to find what can truly help us to nurture this very rich idea. The second theme which comes to mind is that when it comes to a humanism of the future, we have to embrace different realities. Initially, humanism identified the study of humanism, a certain degree of culture and literature, which was interested in ancient culture and ancient literature, with all of its different ways of expression. And then over time, the term humanism has come to identify any thought which places the human being at the very center of things. Human autonomy, including autonomy vis-a-vis God. But of course, many humanists in the Renaissance were authentic Christians who believed that man was created in the image of Christ, and religion is a solid foundation for their search for humanity. It's an idea of humanity which is rich and strong and beautiful. Therefore, one of the real challenges of this day and age is to find value in humanity and giving meaning to it without having to focus on the functioning of our economies and international relations. We I agree on these ideas, of course, but we also have to take stock of the huge pressure we all face. The pressure linked to globalization, a pressure due to which our lifestyle becomes increasingly homogeneous. We all use the same products in all corners of the world. We watch the same movies. We use the same social networks. We share the same ideas. And therefore, within the context of globalization, we have to try to focus on our values, our differences, our specificities. We often think of the diversity of spirituality as something which is an obstacle to humanity, maybe the last obstacle to humanity, to work together and to set common goals and to serve the achievement of those goals. And I have to recognize, of course, that religions contribute to passions, and they often create a violent confrontation between human beings. And therefore, we, representatives of religions, always tend to say that our religions are being exploited and distorted by these types of conflict. But I think we have to recognize that the religious fact, or what we Christians refer to as faith, end up stirring a sense of the absolute in human beings, which imbue human beings and the representation of our world. And therefore, we always face this risk, the risk that the inner violence present in all human beings may end up emerging. And therefore, this human violence, this inner violence we have, may end up being nurtured by faith, by religion, becoming something absolute. However, with this risk in mind, humanity must not dilute and reduce our differences through the culture of superficiality, through a constant sharing of emotions and relations, which leads to globalization. I think the various religions represent the way in which we interact with God, with one another, with the universe. I think it's useless to try to summarize them. We have to accept the contradictions we face, but at the same time, we have to work to overcome all of this. We have to strive for unity in humanity. And we also have to work to make sure that love prevails over violence. Father de Lubac was able to write that religions should not be explored from their most mediocre achievements, but rather through their spiritual peaks. And he added that once one has climbed a peak, one finds oneself more distant from others. But this diversity should not frighten us. We must find in it an encouragement to deepen our humanity. Setting humanism as an end is a valuable goal. We're not obliged to understand humanism as a watering down of the singularity of our spiritualities. We have to explore one another. And this idea of opening to our achievements. And I'd like to quote Mid-Malouf, who says that the other is so different and so familiar, so different and yet so close. And therefore we have high values we have to strive towards. We don't have to think that humanism is a way of watering down our spirituality. Humanism, in fact, is a promise. It is a way of allowing us to tap into the wealth of all of our traditions. And as a person who represents a religion, I think it's safe to say that we all have the responsibility of nurture the humanism of diversity. We have to nurture our ability to find inspiration in all of mankind's achievements. Since we have all been working to look for the beauty of our roots, and therefore we have to understand that we are one humanity linked by a common spiritual destiny. I think that is the meaning behind the call for humanity signed by Pope Francis and the Grand Imam at the Al-Azhar Mosque a few years ago. Meetings such as this and the meetings that I myself have in France are proof of the fact that we are striving towards that goal, which is a real hope for all of mankind, regardless of the tragedies we all face. Thank you. Thank you, Éric. Thank you for being perfect in terms of your timing and for offering such profound content. A globalization purely based on the market isn't good enough. And your ideas on how important religions can be for humanity and for all of us is especially important. Thank you very much, Éric. And now I'd like to give the floor to Professor Agnès Levallois, who has a degree at INALCO in Arabic. She teaches at the Foundation for Strategic Research with a specific focus on the geopolitical processes in the Eastern Arab world. And I think that is a way of dealing with some of the most difficult and problematic elements of our contemporary world, the one which most needs peace. Thank you, and over to you, Professor.
Merci beaucoup. Et tout d'abord, je dois exprimer mon plaisir et honneur d'être ici parmi vous ce matin.
Thank you very much.
C'est tout un programme, mais je tiens.
Imagine Peace is very important. As Vice President of the lay French Academy,
Et de vous dire ce qu'est cette mission laïque et en quoi, eh bien, ce que nous faisons rejoint les interrogations qui sont les nôtres. Je vais commencer bien évidemment par quelques mots. Cette mission française qui a été créée en 1902, qui est une association publique, indépendante, même si elle a des liens forts avec l'État, et dont l'objectif est de diffuser dans le monde la langue et la culture française par l'éducation. Nous avons un certain nombre d'établissements scolaires.
So the idea is to disseminate the language and French culture through education and also savoir-faire, which is our own. It is very important since this is a factor for dialogue between societies. This word, dialogue, is key.
En fait, les principes.
As the charter of the mission says, the founding principles are solidarity, dialogue amongst cultures. These are the values of humanism. So we are brought closer to today's topic. The founder of this mission, lay mission Deschamps, has gone through a particular journey to create this mission and this network of institutes in the world He comes from a village in the middle of France, so he attended the Chateau Clou school, and after completing his studies, he began teaching in countries that were French colonies back then, so Tunisia, La Réunion, Madagascar. And he was impressed by something in particular. He realized that there was no education and training adapted to colonized populations, and he decided to create this mission, whose goal was to act as a sort of counterweight for the education proposed by the religious institutions.
En fait, à se perfectionner.
And the idea is to bring the local populations to actually enhance their traditions rather than go against their nature. And this is the goal that brings us closer to what we are talking about. So placing more value on diversity and not standardizing a model to different societies that don't share the same history. Evidently, this vision must be contextualized. We must recall what's the context we are referring to. It was the era of colonialism, and of course things would be different today, but it is very important to start from this background. Pierre Deschamps was obsessed with the drama of failure, the failure of the education of the colonized peoples, colonization from the European institutions. He realized that we needed to do something because the very same principle of colonization was a principle of ruling rather than helping to place more value on their traditions, on their faiths, on their ideas. Just to tell you a short story, when I was young, I had the pleasure to spend a few years in New Caledonia at the end of the 60s or 70s. And in schools, people were talking about our ancestors, the Gauls. So think about what it means for the young people that were with us to talk about our ancestors, the Gauls. So it was important for them to talk about this, but it was equally important to talk about their history.
Partie de cela.
So the idea of the mission was precisely this. So a project developed like the one developed by Pierre Deschamps was presenting humanism and dialogue among cultures. More than once we have talked about a lay mission. The word laity is at the heart of this project. In the current context, it is very important to bear this in mind. Laity is meant as respect of the freedom of conscience, so the building of a space that can welcome with no distinction students of different backgrounds, origins, beliefs, with a pedagogy that is based on reason and a critical spirit. These are the key words, the beacons of the teaching that we share, this notion of laity that is not always well understood. It is a context I know very well.
Et là, je parle sous le contrôle de ce terme de laïcité, puisqu'au Maghreb, on va dire laïkia, qui est une façon française dans la langue arabe permettant de se raccrocher à une signification de ce que cela veut dire. Et si on est au Proche-Orient,
Sorry, there's a problem with the microphones. When I switch on the microphone in the English booth, the microphone in the other booth switches off. So, the semantic root of science and reference to the contemporary world. when we talk about laity in the Arab Muslim world, we realize that this notion is imported from Europe, whereas in the 19th century in the Middle East, where actually people began to focus on the concept of laity, even if the regimes have referred to the French colonial era. So this reflection on freedom and respect of the different beliefs is part of a context where sometimes ignorance leads to reflections that are very distant from reality. So if you don't know, if you don't have this will to start a dialogue in a mutual spirit, you will end up in a stalemate. So it will be really unlikely to imagine peace. Well, I don't want to talk at length, but just would like to say that we are present in many countries in the world, especially in the Lebanon, with the second oldest institute that was established in 1906 in Beirut. This is just to bear witness to how deeply rooted our presence is. And in the current context, it is very important. In the institutes in Beirut, but we also have another institute in Tripoli, where there's a Sunni majority in a region that is prevailingly Shia. And then another area where there is an important Christian presence, where the majority is Sunni. So in a country marked by different faiths and different worships, it is important to have institutes that are actually proposing the notion of laity, a notion of laity that allows for the respect of all beliefs, of all faiths, of all cultures, that allows the young people that come to our schools to be open-minded, so to be able to exchange views, to welcome a teaching that leads to know each other better. And I would like to react to what we heard earlier. We need to observe the other. We need to get out of our comfort zone, which is certainly reassuring, but we must have the opportunity to get out of that, to know the other better, rather than being closed in representation.
Appréhender l'autre, connaître l'autre et faire cette démarche vers l'autre, parce que sans cela, on ne peut aller que dans des conflits et avec une impossibilité à imaginer l'avenir. Et donc, c'est tout à fait la mission, pour reprendre le terme de cette mission laïque, mais la mission de la mission laïque, c'est...
So it's through this teaching that in the Lebanon, in Spain, in the US, we are promoting this will for dialogue, and we are offering the possibility for these young people to know these realities better. So we give them the possibility of facing the world we're living in, where conflicts have never been so many. So through these teachings, through these values of humanism, which we are defending, that are at the heart of our pedagogical project, we can lead them to an openness that will help us solve a number of conflicts, and hopefully some of them have been solved already and will be solved already once they're older, more mature.
Grazie. Grazie, signor Agnès.
Thank you very much. Also for illustrating the work of the French lay mission. I believe that what you were saying about laity is what we are practicing in these meetings, basically. And I would like to quote Éric as well, when he talks about cultures, faiths that have to contaminate each other. So this means stressing the need of being all together to live with greater wisdom and with great richness. And this is a perspective that in these meetings we have seen as being historically effective. Monsignor Éric was quoting the signing in Abu Dhabi between Pope Francis of Al-Tayeb of the Brotherhood Agreement. Sheikh Al-Tayeb participated many times in our meetings, and eventually he came to this proactive conclusion, which is epitomized by the signing of the agreement with Pope Francis. So thank you for an inclusive laity, not an exclusive laity, a laity that welcomes and which does not exclude. Well, there's a difference here when it comes to French and Italian laicite. We will do that in another context, but it's important to continue with this common relationship to promote a humanism that is inclusive. Now, I would like to hand the floor over to our friend. No.
Filosofo, amico di Morale. Sul pensiero.
I would like to stress the floor. I would like to hand the floor to Mauro Ceruti, a philosopher from the IULM University in Italy, to promote a next step to a simple humanism that is of a Renaissance background. So there's a next trauma we should cover when faced with the new global perspective that, for example, sees a particular strong weight of the relationship between man and nature. Not rarely has man been masters in the, of course, wrong definition of a humanism that must be key, must be central, without enslaving nature. So, Mario, the floor is yours.
Grazie, Don Vincenzo.
Thank you very much. And Monsignor Paglia has already said it all. He mentioned all the essential things, and therefore I'd like to make a few comments on that. And it's easier for me to relate to his introduction. And it's also easy to relate with the words he used to introduce our forum. I think that if we want to rebuild the reasonable hope for world peace, for a possible world peace, in this day and age in which world peace appears to be so distant to so many, to do that, again, I think we have to begin with the new elements in current human condition. I think this new human condition is marked by a radical turning point in our history, which we continue to remove. And I'm referring to the atomic explosion in Hiroshima in 1945. At the time, what we witnessed was a possibility that we had never considered before, namely the possibility for humanity to self-annihilate itself. In other words, the human species became potentially suicidal due to its progress, due to its technological progress and the global interconnections made possible by technology. This possibility for self-annihilation led to something new from the anthropological standpoint. It led to a common destiny for all of the world's peoples. They were all linked to the same dangers and the same opportunities. In fact, humanity became a real community with a shared destiny. And now the real risk for self-annihilation has increased. We now have a higher risk of nuclear weapons being used in local conflicts, and the threat has become increasingly dramatic. Now, this is an unprecedented possibility for self-annihilation. And what it does is it underscores a paradigm, which is what Pope Francis refers to in his encyclicals. He refers to the paradigm of the vision which continues to guide relations between the world's peoples and humanity as a whole and Earth. What that paradigm is the paradigm which has always nurtured the history of humanity. And I define it as being the zero-sum game paradigm, in which I win and you lose, in which you lose and I win. And I think that if we continue to organize our life in international relations and economies and our social relations and the relationship between genders, if we continue in these games, so to speak, can be a disaster, given the unprecedented power we have and given the unprecedented interdependence on our planet. The risk is that we all lose. The human impact on the biosphere and nuclear weapons make it possible for humanity to self-destruct globally. This is something unprecedented. It's striking. As Don Vincenzo was saying earlier, humanity is now forced to emerge from the era of war. It is mandatory for us to go beyond the zero-sum game paradigm. We have to move towards a positive sum game paradigm in which we all win. But there's another event which makes this current global human condition unprecedented. Humanity, the human species, is no longer a mere biological agent. We're also a geological agent, thanks to our technological power. Our impact on natural cycles is comparable to a geophysical power. This is something recent. It's unprecedented. And as we all know, geologists and earth scientists refer to a new geological era in the history of our Earth. We are now living in the Anthropocene, which means that the world has now entered into our political agenda. In other words, we now deal with the entire Earth, which is connected by both material and immaterial networks. And for the very first time, all of humanity mirrors all of the Earth. And all of humanity is no longer an abstract idea. It is no longer something sentimental, something that thinkers and our religions have referred to in the past within our respective cultures. The entire humanity has now become an actual reality. The entire humanity now shares a common destiny in all of its diversity. And this, of course, was made possible by humanity's progress and by the possibility of self-annihilating that this progress entails. And that, in turn, requires a new culture, a new paradigm. It requires a new form of accountability and responsibility within a new vision. That's why wars in this day and age are so dangerous, because they fracture that which is united. They divide a humanity which is united and interdependent by the processes of globalization. It is a humanity which now faces the same dangers and the same opportunities. And therefore, wars are an obstacle when it comes to dealing with what is truly crucial. We have to imagine new supranational institutions that can deal with the structural vulnerabilities and the complexities that our humanity faces, generated by the simultaneous increase in our technological capabilities and in our increased interdependence. Complexity, the way in which everything is connected to everything else in our world, and this planetary humanity we have become also bring about a new challenge. We have to create a global humanism that contains the meaning of the inextricable bond of everything with everything else. We require a global humanity based on solidarity between one another and our planet. We have to work with one another and with and for our planet. This isn't a mere slogan. It is a must which stems from our condition. And this global humanism, which recognizes this co-evolutionary relationship we have with all of the world's players, be they living and non-living. And this stems from our beliefs and our scientific knowledge on our history. And it shows that this co-evolutionary idea, which isn't the one described by Descartes when he described humanity as being the master of everything else. This idea of a coexistence is essential if we want to survive. Co-evolutionary idea. This is a humanism that isn't the one described by Descartes when he described humanity as being the master of everything else. This idea of a coexistence is essential if we want to survive, if we want to have a fruitful future. This is a humanism that can also express a universalism, which would be the actual fulfillment of humanism of the Renaissance, in which all human beings are equal, regardless of our differences of religion, culture, and so on, above and beyond all that. Global humanism is a humanism that expresses a universalism that considers human beings as being equal, not above and beyond their differences, but through their differences, which is no minor feat, I think, because classical humanism was two-faced. It also had a darker side, and equality above and beyond differences was often founded on a hierarchy. Could have been progressive in the interpretation of diversity, which led to justifying the annihilation and the colonialization of diversity, in which one culture was evolved and the other were childish, which were recognized as being human and which could be converted to the real culture. And therefore, if we want to nurture and disseminate a culture of peace, we have to understand the twofold challenge we face in this day and age. We have to strive for peace between ourselves to safeguard the earth, and we have to achieve a peace with the earth to safeguard ourselves. Humanisms in this complex area in which everything is connected, as said in Laudato Si, asks of us to develop a conscience based on universal solidarity and universal brotherhood. It may seem a paradox to refer to brotherhood while we witness wars, dramatic wars, which may lead us to the brink of the abyss. And perhaps we are already on that brink. Solidarity is based on the feeling of a mutual belonging, in which we all belong to the same community, in which we all act towards a common goal. But, of course, brotherhood was and may continue to be a close brotherhood in which we feel we are brothers while we build an enemy, It makes us feel we're brothers against somebody else. That's what nationalism did. Nationalisms have strengthened that kind of brotherhood, a brotherhood which separates. And nationalism has been on the rise in the recent years, following the catastrophes brought about by the two world wars. Nowadays, our solitude, our daily experiences lead us towards looking for protected niches, scapegoats, and enemies. We tend to close in on ourselves. We tend to simplify things and focus on our identities. And now history has brought us to a crossroads. We are on the brink of an obscure precipice, but at the same time, we are on the eve of a possible and extraordinary positive leap in our process of humanity. We can search for the reasons of hope. We can imagine a hope within uncertainty which characterizes our human experience. We can have the hope that despite everything, we are shaping a global conscience, a conscience which embraces all of humanity, which is one and multiple at the same time. A community marked by a common destiny. Nowadays, for the very first time in the history of humanity, fraternity can be defined in a truly universal horizon. And I think that is what motivates the statement which was already mentioned by a president, namely that no one can save him or herself alone. It is an existential duty we have. And that's why the perspective for peace in this era of complexity in which everything is connected has to be linked to education, so that we can, in fact, shape a global humanism that I referred to very briefly. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mauro. Thank you, Professor Ceruti, for sharing your thoughts with us. And while you were speaking, I remember that already many centuries ago, the idea you expressed was already possible. Francis of Assisi referred to his friars as brothers. He referred to the sun as brother. He referred to the moon as a sister. He referred to water as a sister. He referred to the wolf as brother. He also referred to the Sultan of Egypt as a brother. And he traveled to him. This global humanism that Francis of Assisi testified to, I think, can be an inspiration for the world we live in. Last month I was in Hiroshima with a number of other religious leaders to sign a document on artificial intelligence and ethics. And the good news there was that since 1945 and all the way up to the present, no other nuclear weapons were used, which goes to show that it is possible. It means that if we choose to never use atomic bombs again, we can. I was born in 1945. I'm 79 years old. And luckily for me, I never witnessed another atomic weapon being used. And I do hope that for the next 75 years and beyond, this will never happen again, which goes to show, again, that we can imagine peace, although we live in a very dark era. Hans Jonas, while referring to ecology, said that we are on the brink of the abyss, and Heidegger said that only God can save us. And from that point of view, I think this morning's debate is important as a way of continuing to hope and imagine peace. I'd like to now give the floor to our friend Olav Tveit, who is the presiding bishop of the Conference of Bishops of Norway. He is a dear friend of ours, and it's almost natural for me to give him the floor. Thank you very much indeed. Over to you.
Thank you, and thank you for this opportunity to address you as sisters and brothers, as we do in our Christian conferences, but I think it is also proper to say this in a conference like this. We are, as sisters and brothers, aware that it is not good for human beings to be alone, as the first chapters of our Bible says. And these chapters also tell us that we are the guardian of our sister and brother, because we are human and because we are accountable to our Creator. This wisdom of the creation stories are extremely relevant when we discuss our theme today. In the ecumenical movement that has some landmarks, we next year will celebrate that the Archbishop of the Church of Sweden, Nathan Söderblom, convened the Universal Christian Conference on Life and Work, discussing social cooperation for peace after the World War I. And this ecumenical conference, that then happened to be very closely related to the aims of the League of Nations, saw these aspiring tendencies to join efforts in creating a common ground for peaceful coexistence. Later on, after the Second World War, we saw the Universal Declaration of Human Rights expressed and finalized, and the founders of the World Council of Churches, which was established in 1948, was strongly involved in drafting some of these texts, particularly on the freedom of religion. A condition for this Declaration of Human Rights was the notion of humanistic values as transcending the specific arguments and intentions preceding them. And in a simplified manner, I would argue here that the values we need to live together must be constantly tested in a mutually accountable discourse and cooperation. We are accountable to what kind of values we are promoting, and also the effect and the results of how we claim and promote them, whether they are promoting life and caring for the lives of others through justice, freedom, peace, and truth. Well, I might say, yes, these are my values based on my Christian faith. But I might also ask myself, are these actually only Christian values that I cannot share with others? And if so, are they then real values? In our society today, the human rights and international regulations and law based on them, with the many structures that have been built up to secure and protect these laws, are the best, I would say, the best foundation to secure and work for peace. And the conflicts raging the world today, especially the prominent, as they are very prominent in the Russian invasion of Ukraine, in the terror attack from Hamas, and in the Israeli retaliations against not only Hamas, but now what appears as a collective punishment of the whole people of Gaza. These are grim illustrations of how the values of common humanism is under pressure. They are even neglected and abandoned. And these are not even the most, as they are the most illuminated conflicts and wars in the world, they are not the only one, and maybe not only the worst examples of violations against human life, human dignity, and human rights. So the rule of law to protect life of all is constantly replaced by other rules and interests of power. The point I will make here is, from this perspective of religion that I represent, is that the worst of all wars are what is called, or somehow might be called, a holy war, because it is motivated by something divine, or what we claim to be divine, and then there are no barriers to what can be used as means to achieve our goals. The worst wars are the holy wars. And I would say also no religious leaders can claim that we really are speaking in the name of God. The God as the source of life, as Psalm 36 says, cannot lead to the destruction of all kind of regulations, but also all kind of respect for life. As Professor Riccardi said, it is a blasphemy when it happens. But it happens. And what is then our response? What do we see together? What can we do together? Not only when we are facing these events these days, but also we face our history of colonization, when we also face the present expressions of dehumanization in our societies, in Europe, also the societies we claim to be based on common human values. Whether it is anti-Semitism, anti-Islam reactions and attitudes, or other forms of racism. The dehumanization we face today is unfortunately not something new, but it is what we have to deal with when we look at our common future and how should it be done something differently. In this, the critical discourse is needed more than ever. A critical discourse that gives us a mutual accountability that should be more than only a condemnation. It should lead to expressions of mutual acknowledgement of the contributions and gifts of others, both in religious and not religious ideas and traditions. The urgent needs for imagination for peace, which is the theme of this significant conference, needs both a strong human, basic human approach, not discriminating other faiths or identities, but I would say it also needs the practice and attitude of prayer, where we as human beings formulate our hopes and our values in a transcendent relation to God. This makes us involved in a relationship to all who pray to God, but also to all of God's creation. And therefore, a Christian hope is a hope for all, for the whole of creation and all that God loves. And otherwise, it is not a Christian hope. Therefore, the need for a mutually accountable relation between us as religious and secular, whoever we are, must be shared as a common duty. It's a matter of building trust through our relations and through our structures of cooperation, also in times of peace, for the difficult days when they come. And therefore I want to share with you two examples from my homeland, Norway, that has been illustrating this for me the last years. Particularly this year, we mark 1,000 years of what we called Kristenretten, the Christian law code that was established in 1024 by King Olav and Bishop Grimkjell, and the 750 years of what is called Landslova, one of the very few early European national legislations for the whole nation. Both are expressions of what we could call Christian values, contradicting the older Norse values. On the other side, they are somehow a discovery for many in our country today, as the Christianization of Norway is seen as a dehumanization of others, a very inhuman way of Christianize our people. We now learn, at least many more learn, that, for example, the Christian faith was introduced by these legislation. More than many other means, it meant that we had to be human together. And let me illustrate this by two dimensions that I've never thought of in this perspective. This Christian legislation said that there should be built church buildings everywhere in this country. And there should be churchyards where everybody should be given a grave at the same place. What does that mean? Well, that means that for the first time, everybody, and at that time everybody, had to be under the same roof sometimes in their lives. That never happened otherwise. The slave and the lord, the woman and the man, the old and the child, everybody had to be in the same building, learning the same prayer, saying the same prayer, receiving the same message, and the same sacraments. The graveyard meant that there was no difference between human beings in a very concrete and very visible way. Where I lived for 10 years in Geneva, outside Geneva, in Ceruti, there is a graveyard, and above the entry to this graveyard it says, "Ici égalité." That is a deep Christian value. And we all face it at that stage, but also the graveyards give us the manifestation of this reality. I say this because sometimes we discuss ideas and Christian values and other values only in terms of what we discuss in conferences or meetings or in books and seminars. The values we have, they manifest themselves in many ways. And this is one of the very important history expressions we have in our country that is now rediscovered by those who say, no, we have only human values from the Enlightenment, or maybe from the Reformation. It's another understanding of that our human values, also as Christian values, are much deeper and much stronger rooted in our history, but also in our realities. Another one. In 2012, the decision was made that the Church of Norway should be disestablished in its relationship to the state, at least in the legal way. And then it was also decided that there are many conditions for this, and two of them are interesting for us now. One is that there should be expressed structures and books for our teaching in the schools, where everybody had to be exposed to the other faiths and values in a very systematic and also deep understanding of one another. This was also seen as a duty of the state. And secondly, that all faith communities, whether they are faith communities in terms of religious communities or life stance communities, should be supported financially by the state according to the membership. We can see this again as, well, how the state wants to make peace and not to create a lot of internal problems. I see them also as an understanding that if we want to accept that the different values are not only belonging to one group, we have to make it clear by structures in our societies. Let me end by saying that these kind of conferences and with this kind of theme, we show that we have something real deep in common, whether we are believers or not, whether we are Christians, Muslims, Jews, whatever we are, and that is our hope for the future. That is a shared hope. It is expressed maybe in a very deep, maybe the deepest way in our prayers, and maybe the prayers is actually what makes us human. Thank you.
Grazie.
Thank you. Thank you for also sharing some Norwegian and international history with us. Thank you for mentioning the huge potential we have. You mentioned 1948, after the Second World War. Well, after the Second World War is when Europe was created, the UN became stronger, the Charter of Human Rights was drafted, which means that despite those tragedies, it would have been possible to find ways to unite. And I think that we are facing a similar situation now. We have an urgent need to find all of our potential, even in our religions and in our cultures. And we have to be able to pool them. That's the real challenge we face. Here we are in France. And the words liberté, égalité, fraternité continue to be important. Unfortunately, fraternity was the promise which hasn't still been kept. That's why today our differences underscore the need for fraternity we all have. Because brothers and sisters are often different. They have to be. And therefore, if we remove diversity from the picture, we would be committing a crime. That's why it's so essential for the plurality of human reality can lead towards unity. And that's also a political duty. And now I'd like to give the floor to Nadia Marzouki, who teaches political science here in Paris. She is an expert in Islam and religious freedom, both in the West and in the Maghreb. And therefore, I think she can tell us a lot about both Europe and the Mediterranean. Now, you're not a politician, you're a professor. But, of course, politics is the art of bringing different realities together so that they can live in peace. Over to you. Good morning, everybody. And I'd like to begin by thanking the community of Sant'Egidio very warmly for giving me this wonderful opportunity to think together and to have an important discussion in this era marked by war. Now, I'd like to spend the next 10 minutes on the idea of a duality between believers and non-believers. Of course, within the community of Sant'Egidio, there is this custom of working together. But in debates and literature and the sphere of political science and public debates, unfortunately, there's still this stark divide between believers and non-believers. And this divide, especially in France, has become something almost old-fashioned, in which we tend to believe that religion is linked with superstition and being old-fashioned. Of course, there are many nuances in this idea, although it is an idea which continues to be very much present. And therefore, today, also based on my work, and I'm currently working on theo-moral disobedience, I'd like to describe the way in which this paradigm isn't operational when we think about the conflicts in the contemporary world. I'd like to share the hypothesis in which, in this day and age, we have a divide between believers who are united by the same faith and the belief that they can live with one another, and on the other, believers and non-believers who have the same identitarian and territorial beliefs. Now, this clash between these two ways of believing and non-believing is shared by all spiritual and religious traditions, and it is shared by non-believers. There are those who are dogmatic and intolerant amongst non-believers, and there are those who are atheists or agnostic who are open. Some believers are skeptical, and then you also have men and women of faith. Now, let me give you some examples which stem from ethnography to prove how this clash has been replaced by, on the one hand, faith and conscience, and identitarianism and nationalism on the other. And I'd also like to describe the world we live in today. Now, let's begin by discussing the clash between believers and non-believers and the struggle for democracy and peace on the one hand, and extremist ideology on the other. We continue to have this clash in political sciences and in the public debate between religion and non-religion, which doesn't allow us to build coalitions which bring peace and democracy. And therefore, I think it's important to underscore all of these examples and discuss them. Now, let me begin by analyzing the country I grew up in, Tunisia, where the clash between Islamists and secular people has been discussed at length. Let me begin by discussing a paradox. The most liberal constitution in the Arab world was passed only a few years ago. And Article 6 of the Constitution, which is now being questioned, guaranteed freedom of conscience, which was a first in the Arab world. A constitution that guarantees the right to believe or not believe, and which guarantees the freedom of conscience, was unprecedented. And since 2021, in the name of a mix of anti-imperialist nationalism and Marxist-Leninist ideology and the anti-Islamic ideology of this regime, we have seen the failure of this new progressive democratic experiment, which began after 2011 and which was led by a coalition of both believers and non-believers. In Italy, in Germany, in Switzerland, in the United States, I met communities of faith who transform their communities in sanctuaries to welcome migrants. And they work hand in hand with both believers and non-believers, even going against very restrictive laws on the topic of migration. And even in Italy, I met and worked with a number of people who work to promote brotherhood and solidarity. And they include Paolo Farinella in Genoa, who describes himself as being an atheist, thanks to God. Along the lines of Buñuel, who said he was an atheist, thanks to God. I also met people of the Alessandro Santoro community, who founded a community on the outskirts of Florence, which offers solidarity and welcomes poor migrants, who sees his mission as the only way of being loyal to others and to work to achieve God's dream. Now, these experiences, which are marked by skepticism, aren't a way of refusing religion. They are a way of being religious and spiritual, which are the opposite of being dogmatic. And this approach exists in all religious traditions. I also work with the Essayist communities who chose to bury the bodies of migrants, as the previous speaker mentioned, to show solidarity through the burial of these migrants. And they did this in the name of Islam. In the United States, since 2014, a group of young progressive Jews have been demonstrating against the massacre in Gaza in the name of their religious tradition. Theirs is both a religious and political commitment. They have been mobilizing to organize the Occupy Grand Central Station demonstration. They try to raise awareness in the public opinion based on their moral and religious beliefs. And the name of their group was taken from Hillel the Elderly. If I am not for myself, who will be for me? And if I am only for myself, what am I? If not now, when? And as you yourselves were saying, we must save ourselves together. And therefore, we have to strive to achieve the slogan which says that we have to free ourselves together. American Jews want to free themselves from anti-Semitism while freeing themselves from all other forms of discrimination at the same time. All of this shows that the contemporary world is marked by a clash not between believers and non-believers, but between two concepts of what the word us means. those who think that we have to differentiate ourselves from others, and we have to see others as an enemy, and those who think that we can be united in diversity. There are those who think that they are the chosen people, whereas others think that they can work to help one another. But another important thing is that faith isn't isn't something merely spiritual. The idea of expressing one's faith publicly is central. And that may be the main obstacle when it comes to analyzing peace and democracy, especially in France. In France, some believe that believers cannot be part of democratic peace unless they are invisible. They think that non-believers are, by definition, acquired partners. Although a number of recent examples show that non-believers can also be the enemies of peace and democracy, and that believers who are committed to achieving social justice have to be able to express their ideas publicly. Another element which is being debated very much is what we can or cannot believe in. And as Olivier Roy wrote in Le Jour de la Mort, we are living in an era of nihilism, in an era of populism. We're living the very end of progressive ideas. But the mobilizations that I mentioned are also the expression of deep-rooted moral beliefs. We have gone from the era of mass movements to the era of moral movements. They may be micro-movements, almost. The people I work with in English-speaking countries often refer to what they do as being prophetic activism, as a remnant. They are witnesses, almost. Although they aren't very many, and therefore they cannot lead to a mass movement. Now, this change is something which is a real challenge for analysts. We have to try to imagine change in a different way, not simply by searching for major narratives. We have to pay close attention to this real constellation of storytelling. It is also a challenge for the state and for public authorities, who often don't know how to deal with these mobilizations, if not by criminalizing them, by saying that they are a threat to law and order. And therefore, what world are we heading towards? Well, we have a number of paradigms that can allow us to rethink the shift from morals to politics. And I think that there are a few paradigms we see in social sciences that can lead to democracy, which can include communities of faith. These models are a civil religion, the Abrahamic dialogue, and embodied solidarity. The idea of civil religion, discussed by Tocqueville, was also described by Robert Bellah, the American sociologist of religions. It is the idea that the republic and civil life is founded on the sharing of a limited number of principles and values. This is something that, ever since the 1960s, was criticized by many researchers as being too theoretical, too abstract, too naive. Then we have the Abrahamic dialogue, which is the idea of a fundamental convergence between Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, based on the common principles of peace and solidarity. And within the context of the current escalation in the Middle East, we're seeing how difficult it is to process this model unless it is rethought. For instance, my friend, the Palestinian pastor Mitri has criticized the shortcomings of this paradigm. But of course, I think that these paradigms have to be considered in terms of their wealth, and they have to be analyzed through the lens of the current ongoing conflicts in the Middle East. And we also have to link them to the new things brought about by these micro movements I mentioned. Now, when facing these micro communities which express solidarity from the margins and by expressing solidarity through resistance, perhaps we should even rethink the way in which we tend to always search for mass movements. And to quote Mark 12:10, the stone that was discarded by builders has now become the cornerstone. So maybe that's what we have to start looking for, the fragments. The moral and theological resistance groups that I study have a relationship with time and action, which isn't the classic way of approaching time and action. They describe a new way of trying to strive for peace and democracy. There is a form of infinite openness and freedom in this approach, which also leads to a form of political action. Now, how can we build common worlds unless we have a cornerstone? How can we give value to the stone fragments I mentioned? I think that's one of the real challenges we face in the current world we live in. And thank you very much for having given me the opportunity to take the floor in front of all of you.
Grazie a Nadia.
Thank you very much, Nadia, for your comments, and given your country of origin, this is even more significant. In our experience, with many forms of our dialogue, we've always underlined the close relationship between faith and reason, or better, between faith and culture. So when faith is stripped of culture, it actually becomes dangerous, because before without knowledge, you don't know about other people's values, beliefs. So that's a difference between a faith that thinks and a faith that does not think any longer. That's a big difference. And this is exactly what you were mentioning when talking about Oliver Ra. It actually makes sense, because fundamentalisms, wherever they come from, they are all marked by the elimination and removal of knowledge. Knowledge ties bonds and connections with others. And this is the big challenge that we try to rise up to with our meetings. We've got many positive experiences of friendship, loyalty, with towards many very different worlds that are brothers and sisters for us now. So it is impossible to think of the community of Sant'Egidio without thinking of the connections and relations that we got in place with many other experiences, religious and non-religious, none of them exclusive. It is like a big Catholic, and when I say Catholic, I'm not referring to the Catholic religion, but to universal sense. It's a big Catholic community. Well, I'm saying this to introduce our friend Tarek Mitri from the Lebanon. We are pretty worried for what is happening today in the south of your country. When we visited your country many years ago, it was actually the Switzerland of the Middle East. I think you might recall that. You have covered several positions with the government of the Lebanon, and I think you might recall many experiences of brotherhood that were absolutely extraordinary. Today the problem is way bigger and more complicated. And Tarek is a man of the Middle East. He was personally involved also in the Libya question and many humanitarian and political challenges. So I'll hand the floor over to Tarek, a lawyer friend, and so we're really pleased to listen to what he's going to tell us.
Thank you very much. The document on human fraternity signed in Abu Dhabi by Pope Francis and Sheikh al-Azhar Ahmad al-Tayyib in February 2019 concludes by an invitation to reconciliation and fraternity among believers and non-believers. It invites all people who have faith in God and faith in human fraternity to unite and work together and reinforce the bond of fundamental human rights to ensure a dignified life for all, avoiding the politics of double standards. In his encyclical letter, Fratelli Tutti, of October 2020, the Pope states clearly that human rights are not equal for all, and therefore insufficiently universal. In these two texts, as well as in a few others, we acknowledge the upholding of humanist values emanating from inherent human dignity for all. Not too long ago, the discussion around the universality of human rights was rather difficult, using arguments pertaining to culture and to political traditions. There were those who criticized the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as an expression of secular humanist values. Conversely, there were those who suggested that the values embedded in the Declaration were not alien to their faith, even if they do not see in it any trace of religious language. The discussion mirrored a disagreement over the relation between the rights of men and women and the rights of God, as some would like to call them, between a theocentric worldview and an anthropocentric worldview. In 2 decades or more, such a discussion was fraught with misunderstanding. Dialogue among people of faith was in its beginning and did not stand on solid grounds. On the other hand, dialogue between believers and non-believers was very cautious and tended to privilege general, sometimes vague, non-divisive issues over seeking together what could be a universalist humanism. The more dialogue between believers progressed, the chances of dialogue between believers and non-believers were enhanced. Among people of faith, the exchange on universal imperatives moved forward as each religion claimed that its core message is universalist, while struggling with the particularist stream in every religion. What is called the golden rule, do to others what you like others to do to you, was considered central to different faith traditions and mutatis mutandis to secular humanism. However, it was still somewhat caught between the dialectics of universalism and particularism. In the Muslim Dialogue Initiative of 2007, named after the Quranic invitation to a common word, kalimatun sawa, the golden rule was formulated in 2 ways. None of you has faith until you love for your brother what you love for yourself, says the first formulation. But then the second formulation changed the word brother, brother and sister, into neighbor, neighbor, le prochain. Thus, the former had a communitarian connotation and the latter had a universal connotation. Beyond this illustration, the tension between universalism and particularism is yet to be resolved. The convergence between believers and non-believers in approaching universalist humanism is gaining ground, but it does not mean that the line of sand between those with faith and the humanists of no faith has been crossed by all of us. In some circles, controversies, estrangement between people of faith and non-believers did not wane. However, the attempts to transcend the difference between secular humanism and faith-based humanism have harnessed more significance. There are many believers who continue to search for ways of integrating in their religion what they see as amenable aspects of humanism. There are also those who suggest that secular humanism tends, in fact, to retain some of their own religious values, no matter how secular is their language. Be that as it may, the universal affirmation of the principle of humanity, and I'm going to talk about this simple principle, the principle of humanity, is uncontested in theory today, but it is not the case in the concreteness of our present realities. Full adherence to this principle is the way to a humanism for the future. Historically, there have been various references to this principle of humanity, although differently formulated. The Roman humanitas, the Chinese ren, the Thomist conception of natural law, the eternal wisdom of Ibn Miskawayh, the categorical imperative of Kant, all of these are examples. There are various expressions of the inherent character of human dignity carried in the fundamental basic values and humanitarian sentiments. The notion of humanity found itself constantly reinstated in different societies and civilizations. It is the spirit of humanity and humanness that have been guiding those who are behind each milestone since the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, where human dignity constitutes the ultimate value that these rights are supposed to protect. Following the Universal Declaration, many conventions and treaties drew on the very principle of humanity. To name a few, they are the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, the Convention Against Torture, and the Draft Treaty on Crimes Against Humanity. The principle of humanity and international law go hand in hand as universal necessities. International law was permeated by the requirement that every individual has to be treated humanely and with respect under all circumstances and out of humanitarian considerations and the fundamental standards of humanity. The principles of humanity are enshrined in the notions of military necessity, distinction, proportionality, unnecessary suffering. And we see how these principles are absent today in Gaza, in the ongoing carnage in Gaza, and elsewhere in the world. To uphold the standards of humanism through laws and defend the victims, the international community, with the Western nations in the forefront, has entrusted custodians and designed instruments such as the Human Rights Council, the International Court of Justice, and the International Criminal Court. And those very nations that created those instruments do not seem to listen enough to them and support them as much as they should. The international community has empowered such universal instruments and the respect of their advisory opinions and decisions to pave the way for a concrete humanism for the future, which is the theme of our session. A universal humanism cannot tolerate discrimination, cannot accept exceptions under any pretext. And the implementation of human rights and international law needs to be equal for all, as Pope Francis reminds us forcefully. Thank you.
Grazie.
Thank you, Tarek. Thank you for reminding us of this very important statement, which states that there is a primacy in the dignity of all human beings, which is mentioned in the letter between Pope Francis and Altair, but also by Fratelli Tutti. That encyclical was for all of humanity. And we can also remember the other encyclical, Laudato Si, a common house, a common people, for all of humanity. I think that is a vision that can help this humanism of the future that we have to start building right away. And we already have a number of experiences in this regard. And I agree that we should collect all of the experiences everywhere, because those maybe are those discarded stones that we have to recover so that we can have hope for the future. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you to all of our speakers. We now have over 45 minutes to take some questions for our speakers. Maybe we can collect 3 questions at a time. And we have microphones available. And before asking your questions, please introduce yourselves. Make sure your questions are short. We've already heard the presentations. You can also mention if there is a specific speaker you have a question for, so that we can then continue our meeting in an orderly fashion. As we have done so far. All right then, and you can raise your hand if you have a question or a remark. The first question. My name is Frédéric. I am a part of the Brussels community of Sant'Egidio. I wish to thank all of the speakers for their very interesting approaches. I was very interested in the concept of laity and how confusing that can be. Is that something confusing only in Arabic, or can it be confusing for all of our societies? Uh, um, Sometimes Catholics are seen as others. Going back to what Professor Marzouki was saying, there seems to be a monopoly on laity in the political world. In which religions have to be as discreet as possible. Could this lead to an unnecessary conflict? A conflict which would make our societies more and more focused on nihilism, since it is so difficult to find common values, and therefore we choose nihilism. I come from Belgium. You mentioned the Tunisian constitution. The Belgian constitution dates back to 1831. It was criticized by the Vatican for being too liberal. And sometimes history repeats itself. But I want to thank you very much for the ideas you shared.
Se c'è un'altra domanda.
Any other questions?
Buongiorno, je suis Michele Da.
Good morning. My name is Michele Daudia. And I will speak in Italian and I'll sit down. I traveled to Italy over the summer for my summer vacations. And I visited a cathedral while I was in Italy. And the message I read there was, Lord, open our eyes and our hearts and give us the courage to say, no more war. With war, everything is destroyed. Give us the courage to do something concrete to build peace. Signed, Pope Francis. Was that a question? No, that wasn't a question. This was just a message that I read in a cathedral in Italy and which I wanted to share with you. It was a message of peace. I think that peace isn't something which should only be discussed by experts. It should be discussed by everyone. Thank you. Well then, why don't we wait for Nadia to respond to that question. Thank you. Thank you for your question. Thank you for your comment. Yes, you're right. I think there is the approach you were mentioning. We tend to be a little bit more stiff when it comes to the concept of laity. It is becoming a political weapon of sorts, which changes its original spirit. Initially, it was a principle of freedom in France. Now, having said that, what I can say is that in the United States especially, where I have lived and worked, there is an entirely different concept of laity. The First Amendment mentions secularism. There doesn't seem to be this stiff approach towards laity, although we have seen many instances in which the Muslim minority was refused and rejected, but for other reasons. And therefore, we can have different approaches which can be justified in different ways. As far as France is concerned, I think the Muslim minorities, or rather the discrimination experienced by Muslim minorities nowadays, are, I think, the visible tip of the iceberg, although we are facing a more global phenomenon in which we don't understand religion more in general. All of the other religious communities, in fact, share that feeling. Now, why did I mention the fact that we have to see things in the democratic context? We don't only have to see faith as our inner and invisible beliefs. Our faith has to guarantee the conditions through which believers can intervene in the public sphere without being accused of wanting to work to proselytize others. This can be done through solidarity towards migrants, for instance. And it is something which is being done, although it's always accompanied by the fear of being misunderstood. Maybe Agnès could add to that. I do feel that this is one of the main challenges we face for at least the next decade. In other words, we have to be able to pacify the current debate, and we have to overcome this distorted view of laity, which is turning into a political weapon and which transforms its original idea, which was the idea of freedom. Well, since we are discussing laity, and inevitably that leads to talking about France, we could compare the French system to the Belgian one. And in order to do that, I'd like to mention something which I think we overlooked today. We always talk about the relationship between politics and religion, as if religion and politics were two things which have the same importance everywhere, and which always describe the same types of relations or life. Although it seems to me that French laity is the outcome of all of France's efforts to overcome the absolutism of monarchy, because that was how France was organized, which even precedes the idea of religion. This is something which was built progressively because we wanted to overcome the violence brought about by the wars of religion. And other European countries also experienced the wars of religion, although they never experienced the absolutism of monarchy. And therefore, it seems to me, although I may be mistaken, that the absolutism of the monarchy in France has left an inheritance of sorts. In France, we tend to have one language, one school system, and so on. Whereas in Germany, there are many different ways of speaking German. There are many different systems in the various landers, and so on. But if we look at France, there are some very different experiences. The French Catalonia is very different from the history of Ile-de-France. So there is plenty of diversity. Now, one of the main characteristics in France is that laity emerged side by side with the Catholic Church during the Ancien regime. The absolutism of the monarchy wasn't anti-Catholic. And then we had the events which unfolded after the French Revolution. Therefore, in history, we always refer to the outcomes of previous experiences. And that's why things are so complex. And what we're seeing is that there are very many differences through which we separate religion from politics, similar to examples in other European countries. And maybe it would be worth our while to try to come up with a single system in this regard. My name is Dimitri. I come from Brussels. And I have a question for Madame Marzouki. We are facing technology and plenty of bad news. It's almost as if the future has nothing good in store. It's almost as if we're facing a dystopian future. Now, based on your experience, based on your academic background, do you think there is a positive future that we can hope for? Can you give us some examples on the experiences of the past, conservative totalitarianism, the technological tabula rasa? Is there anything positive that we can strive towards rather than catastrophes. Is there anything interesting in your opinion?
Merci pour votre question. C'est vraiment une question importante parce que je pense que...
Thank you for your question. This is an important question. I think that the question of time is a key question. In social sciences, sometimes we only focus on spaces or territories without considering the time factor, because certain movements I've referred to earlier are interesting because they are part of a time that I tend to the time after the apocalypse. I've met many people, I've exchanged views with many people, solidarity movements for migrants, etc. Well, they say that we are already in a post-era, not only a utopian logic, but not even a catastrophistic logic, because the catastrophe has happened already. It is before our eyes. So they are part of a logic that is a sort of eternal present time. And it's pretty intriguing if you think about, because it relieves us of the pressure of results. So that's why I said that they are not part of a classical political action. I lead a campaign to have a result, then of course I assess the results, and then maybe I fine-tune my actions. But they are relieved of the pressure of the result, accepting that there will be failures, necessarily so, but we must move forward. And we must think of this new relationship with the time factor that I usually refer to as atopic or utopian, because we are in a temporary no man's land. Once again, this relieves them of the pressure that politicians and sociologists often consider to be a failure, a lack of strategy, whereas this paves the way for creativity. So it is a phenomenon that should be further elaborated on, I believe. There's another question here. Good morning, thank you for this conference. My question is how to have a humanism in a world of peace. And I'm referring to the genocide of Yazidi perpetrated by Daesh, which is a minority from Middle Eastern Iraq. How can we bring peace to the victims of a genocide? A genocide has not been acknowledged. We've got a draft bill in France to recognize this genocide. Thank you. The question was for someone in particular? Anyone who's willing to answer?
Bon, j'ai essayé de répondre un peu à cette question.
I'll try to give an answer to this question. It took some time to have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, to actually accept these declarations and for them to become an international reference. But we needed to create structures to make sure that crimes against humanity were actually exposed, or, for example, the genocide you're referring to. In international institutions, there's been great consideration in regard to this problem, and it's been a widely debated question. I believe that there are these instruments in important Western countries that are making these instruments universal, but they're not given the instruments to do their job, really. They are set aside for political reasons, clearly. There are human rights that are well protected in a country over another. And this is what we commonly refer to as the double standard policy.
À faire ensemble.
I think we still have a long way to go together. And a meeting like this should help us acknowledge the fact that we've got an instrument that we could use to exert pressure on our governments so that they abide by these conventions that they have developed in the first place.
Speriamo che il
And hopefully President Macron, well, yesterday said he would have repeated the same concerns before the UN, will actually keep his promise. It is obviously essential to make sure